Good morning, and thank you so much to everyone joining us online. Space policy is crucial for shaping the future of the space domain, addressing areas for international cooperation, safeguarding security, and addressing the economic and environmental challenges that arise as more actors are involved in space. I'm Makena Young, a fellow with the Aerospace Security Project here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm so pleased to be joined today by four people who literally put together the handbook on space policy. In the studio with me, we have Mariel Borowitz, Associate Professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, Georgia Institute of Technology, and Bruno Reynaud, researcher at JusGov-Research Center for Justice and Governance and invited professor at the School of Law at the University of Minho. And virtually, we have Thomas Hoerber, the Jean Monnet Chair in European Studies and Director of the EU Asia Institute at the ESSCA School of Management, and Antonella Forganni, Professor in Law and Deputy Director of the EU Asia Institute at the ESSCA School of Management in Angers, France. And they're here to join me in discussion about their new publication, the Routledge Handbook of Space Policy. This handbook offers an overview of the state of play regarding space policy issues and examines possible future developments in space. This discussion will delve into each chapter, which include the themes of space governance and popularization, theoretical structures for an understanding of space policies, and world space policies by geographic areas, and much more. So this volume really offers a comprehensive overview of space policy. I'd love to ask Mariel to start us off and really set the scene. Can you talk about what inspired the creation of this handbook and what impact you hope it has on the space community?
Sure. So first, I really have to give credit to Thomas for being the one who kind of had this idea and had been in conversation with the publisher who was very interested in the idea. And I think the thing that really got me interested in it is it's such a quickly growing field. It's such an important topic. You know, space impacts our lives in so many ways. And so I think, you know, there wasn't anything out there like this. And I think also the opportunity, you know, one of the things Thomas was looking for is to make sure that we had a really international team. And I think the opportunity to do that, work with colleagues in Europe, work with colleagues elsewhere in the world, to put something together on space policy that would get at that truly global aspect, I think was the really exciting element and why now was the right time.
Thank you. So Thomas, I'd love to kind of pull on that thread. In addition to the four of you who were editors and authors in different sections, I believe I counted over 30, almost 40 additional authors, a really wide range of institutions and regions. Again, kind of like what Mariel said, this really speaks to how international the use of space is, how many countries are developing space policy, and how wide-reaching this is. So, Thomas, can you tell us a bit about the trends that you saw when looking at world space policies by geographic area, and just how important it was to really get that international perspective?
Sure. Thank you, Makena, for inviting me to this interview. I can only give the respect to Mariel. It was really a pleasure and a privilege to work with all of them on this book, which we hope will become a reference work for space, not least because of its international outlook. If you look through the chapters that talked about the geographic areas in the book, then we can start with Mariel's chapter herself, who looked at the U.S. space policy, and there I think you can see, and we saw this also yesterday in the workshop which she has organized, that space is for the United States and has always been, I guess, mainly a tool to achieve other policies on this planet. So a means to an end, and I think this is something that we'll probably keep in the future. When you look at Sarah Lieberman's and my own chapter on the European Space Agency and Europe's role in space, then this starts from quite a different perspective. It comes from exclusively peaceful purposes and is actually faced with growing insecurity in the world, which leads the Europeans also to think more about utilitarian uses of space in particularly military security. And this is something that is relatively new. So Europe is still between peaceful and particularly civilian use of space versus an expansion of military activities. We look at China, which is the chapter by Lincoln Hines. It's very difficult to actually say something because most of what you get from China in terms of information on space is not very reliable. So what we see in there is that China is growing its international influence through space. So the classical function of space as a prestige is providing prestige in international politics. But China is also adding to that substantial exploration achievements, such as going to the dark side of the moon. So there we have something which is playing on most of the elements that you find in space policy, and China probably has the means to actually implement that further in the future. Lawrence Rubin talked about the Middle East and what is going on there. So there you find smaller states, such as Qatar, for example, actually engaging in space programs, which are, I would imagine, essentially commercial in use, but in an area which is volatile as the Middle East is. We also know that the dual use potentials of those commercial satellite systems in particular will also have a military aspects to it, or can at least have. When we look at Russia, which is the chapter by Florian Vidal, that's probably the most interesting part, where you can see a declining power, I would say, overall, also declining space power. And there you can go further into the commercial aspects. For example, the Soyuz rocket, which was used by the European Space Agency for years, is of course dead because of that. And the potential alternative of Russia going towards China doesn't seem to be a very reasonable option, because China is actually developing its own infrastructure. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no technology exchange between the two. But from what I've seen there, it is really more of Russia being the delivering technology rather than leading the way in new ways in space. Chapter on Japan is also very interesting, and there I think we have two elements. Japan has always been a haven of stability in the East, in the Pacific area. And I think that will remain for the future, but it's also facing security challenges, such as the nuclear challenge from North Korea in particular, which has, of course, space aspects in it, with the tactical and intercontinental missiles that are used, or the missile technology in general. And that is something I would imagine that the Japanese space policy will also have to respond to in some respect. And finally, the chapter on India, there you can see what many chapters covered in this book on commercialization, in particular with CubeSats, with more commercial applications of space technology and a growing market, if you like. So that is essentially the panoply of chapters that we have there, and it gives a relatively complete impression of what is happening in space policy in the world. We have not had Africa in there. That is really something that is missing, and we also miss the chapter on Turkey, for example, which has started a space program and is progressing there. But overall, in the beginning, we didn't think we could actually put together a complete overview of world space policies. But this is a section with which I'm very happy, because it is relatively complete nevertheless.
Makena, I would maybe add, I think we have this section that Thomas just gave an excellent overview of, about kind of regional, what's happening in different regions or different countries around the world. And so I think it has that nice global coverage. But I think also highlighting, like you mentioned, the span of different authors. So those authors come from, a wide variety of different countries, different expertise in terms of regional expertise or different specific topics, and coming from different kind of academic backgrounds or experience backgrounds. So we have people doing international relations, people doing history, economists. I mean, I think there might even be a scientist and engineer in there. So there's really a wide variety of perspectives represented among this group of authors. So I think that's another thing that makes the book really interesting and really giving you a broad look at the issue of space policy.
Absolutely. And I think that, you just mentioned space policy is really evolving. It is so broad. It comes, it draws people in from so many different backgrounds. And so I'd like to kind of talk about the first chapter that really presents the theoretical structures for understanding these space policies. Antonella, I know that you put this together. So I'd love, from your perspective, how do these frameworks help build national or international space policies in a domain that is so diverse and is so rapidly changing?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question and thank you for inviting me. Well, the first aim of the introductory session is to clarify some key concepts in order to better understand the space policies and the dynamics that are explained in the other sections. Other than that, of course, the space policies cannot be improvised, and we need a solid theoretical framework which can be beneficial for policymakers both at national and international level. The fact that space is changing so quickly, the space sector is very dynamic, does not justify decisions made hastily or without taking into account all the implications. And precisely because it is changing so quickly, we need solid foundations to better decrypt the reality that what we are observing and to anchor our reasoning. So some scholars actually think that the actual impact of space policies studies on policymakers is very limited. I hope that will not be the case for this book. Anyway, some examples of, if I may, of key concepts that need clarification. We can mention space militarization, which must be distinguished from space weaponization. And Svetlana and Isaac has discussed these two concepts through the lens of main traditional international relations theories, realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Besides these traditional theories, the book explores also other theories. Cosmopolitanism is presented by Nicola Schmidt as an alternative to realism, to establish sustainable governance for outer space. And to do that, he drawn on international space law and existing socio-technical structures. Another example that I can mention is the difference between space power in two words and space power in one word. These terms are often used in the literature, in the academic literature, as synonyms, referring to space countries and their capabilities. But Reynaud and his co-author in their chapter explained that to qualify such, there are precise criteria that must be met, for example, autonomy and capability. And finally, speaking about commercialization, space commercialization, which is another big issue which is present in the book, Gregory Miller shows in his chapter that reputation of states plays a fundamental role in establishing partnership, but also in their evolution and their possible termination, and argues that it is possible to lose partners because of one's unreliability. So this is even more timely now, given the current situation, I think. So these are a few examples to show how these notions, these theories, are explained at the beginning and then will appear in all the other sections. So as I said, I think that the book has really solid foundations and theoretical framework.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that really, touches on space has changed a lot since the 60s, when it really was these traditional international powers, space powers, doing everything in space, and now it is so much more commercial. So many more nations are involved, and that's something that I'd really like to pull a thread on a bit more. There's a chapter on society, justice, and the human impact of space activities, which includes the growing commercial sector, as Antonella mentioned, entrepreneurial sector that we're seeing emerge. This includes the sustainability of different orbits and even touches on a bit of gender equality. Bruno, I know that you helped put this chapter together, so I'd love to hear more about how you frame this chapter, how you see this all intersecting, and what some of your biggest takeaways were.
Yeah, sure. I just want to begin by seconding what Mariel and Thomas said. We really were successful in bringing a stellar team of authors and practitioners, people from academia, and we even have a member of the renowned Global Explorers Club, which is Benjamin Poitier, who's one of the leading experts on analog missions. But focusing on this, also, we were able and very successful, but I'm biased, of course, to have a breadth of topics. And within this part 3, we're joining commercialization, law, space sustainability, and also gender issues in European space policy from that perspective. And so if I can run through it a little bit,
please.
I would highlight, I don't want to maybe go run through the authors, but I would highlight what to me is, in the current context of space relations, international relations, and what's going on both sides of the Atlantic, I would highlight the work that was done on commercialization. And so it is a piece there that highlights how you have new space actors emerging, which are the space billionaires. Now there's this term going around here in the U.S., tech bros. We don't have tech bros in space, but we do have people. There's this connection with Elon Musk also, and I think there could be a bit of a misunderstanding of how, given Musk's involvement now in Trump 47 administration. So this chapter here goes back to looking at the Bezos, Musk, and also Sir Richard Branson, and how they changed commercialization, how these single individuals in the era of acceleration, as Thomas Friedman talks about in his book, Thank You for Being Late, the acceleration of flows really gave these individuals the power to bring networks together and really do effective change in the space domain. And there's a before and after commercialization. And this article that we have here by Sarah Lieberman and Kos Siafalis really brings that to the fore very effectively. And then, of course, you mentioned the issue of gender. Gender in space is also a topic that remains important to be looked at in connection with STEM and also having that engagement with at the educational level. And so what Lorna Ryan does is take a look at how European space policy reflects gender issues. And I'm going to highlight that because Europe as a normative power has been recently derided. There's discussion in theory about the value of being a normative power, and if it is a power, if it's only based on norms. But I think there's a positive effect that regarding this topic there, and just want to highlight that. Of course, then we have the issue of space sustainability, which is looked at by economists, which is also another added value that specifically that we have here, as this issue has been mostly dealt with by legal lawyers and also policy people and practitioners. So they're proposing an approach to try and understand how we can manage orbits better, and that's a unique proposal that I think we have in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Talking more about commercialization, I couldn't let this group of experts go without asking about cislunar space, which I think we hear all the time now. There's a big rise in activities aiming to get to the moon and even beyond. Just last week, we had the first successful commercial company land on the moon with Firefly Space. Intuitive Machines did land, though they encountered some difficulty. We have iSpace on its way in a couple of months. Mariel, I know that this is an area that you have been involved with for years. I'd love to hear you speak to the increase of missions and the attention on the moon and kind of that impact. I think we've seen these are mostly commercial missions. So how that plays into it and what that may look like for the future of space policy. And before I turn over to you, I do want to remind our online audience that you can please submit questions through our event page. There should be an Ask Live Questions box, so I don't monopolize all the time that I have with this fantastic group. But Mariel, over to you.
Sure, thanks for the question, Makena. Yeah, I think there is a lot of activity. You gave a great overview of, commercial companies going to the moon, a much wider variety of countries interested in lunar activity and sending missions to the moon. We're seeing, discussion of and even some of the early stages of building infrastructure, so communications and eventually navigation, other capabilities that are for the moon and the area, the area around the moon. So we're seeing all this activity, and I think that is reflected in the handbook. You see multiple chapters that are talking about kind of lunar activity and this phenomena. So, Thomas mentioned that one of the chapter that I have in the book is about kind of U.S. Lunar policy and the phenomena we see of interest across the government, so that you have military, civil, and commercial activity in the U.S. focused on the moon. And I really look at what's of interest, what's the strategic interest for each of those groups, what is the sort of the rhetoric that we hear, what seems to really actually be happening on the ground, and kind of evaluate those, security, geopolitical, and commercial or economic incentives to go to the moon. So, we can look at it from the perspective of domestic policy and domestic strategy. We have a chapter in the governance section by Alana Krolikowski that looks at futures for lunar governance. So, particularly she's focused on space resources, right? So there's a number of both countries and companies who have expressed an interest in gathering and potentially, either using or selling resources collected on the moon. But right now there really isn't a lot to guide us in, the international regimes or international system about what's acceptable in terms of the use of resources. And so Alana lays out 3 different pathways that are possible for lunar resource governance. So anything from a restrictive treaty regime to a regime that's really led by individual national perspectives to something in between. So, thinking about lunar governance. And then I'll say, Bruno actually has a chapter in the section on history looking at the potential for U.S.-China cooperation. It covers a lot of ground in that chapter, but one of the things he talks about is the potential for lunar activity to be a place where the U.S. and China could potentially find some common interests or common ground, even just agreeing about certain guidelines of what's acceptable behavior or how to ensure there's non-interference, that sort of thing. I know you might want to add into that since it's your chapter, but yeah, I think this lunar phenomenon is hugely interesting and important in the space policy community, and we do see that kind of reflected throughout the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, that thinking about the future and all of these exciting missions to the moon, or even low Earth orbit, further out into our solar system, it's fascinating that this expansion of space activities that we have, and this includes, even the weaponization of space, which I know is always a hot topic, opportunities for humans to be out and explore space, and new markets for these space applications. Antonella, I know that you helped put together a chapter on these new frontiers for space, so I would love to hear about what some of your biggest takeaways were when reading these chapters that were put together on what these new frontiers in space and what the future of space activity may look like.
Yes, thank you. Space makes almost everything possible in our eyes and on the larger scale. But that means that we may have great opportunities as well as the ultimate threats. So I could mention the fact that extended human presence in outer space poses, first of all, a significant physical and psychological challenges for people involved in this kind of mission. So these require appropriate preparation. And analog missions on Earth play a crucial role for the preparation of first of all, for studying the effects, and secondly, to develop also the necessary technical and interpersonal skills for space missions. So, as it was mentioned before, Benjamin Potier participated in analog missions and relayed them in his chapter. On the same time, this leads us to think about human presence and human expansion into space, including space colonization. And this is highly controversial. It requires in-depth reflection because, what also Mariel said, there are issues related to governance, to sustainability, and also, again, Nicola Schmidt highlights in another chapter that, reminds us that space sustainability implies peaceful and open access of space for all. However, at the same time, it seems that we are going in the opposite direction. As you said, the militarization of space is a growing concern, and it's parallel to the development of space activities. This is not something new because, as Matthew Jenkins shows, is something that had happened already in history. Development of military objectives on one side and technologies in space actually are in parallel with the civil developments of activities. And here we go with, again, the commercialization of space offers, that space offers. So when we speak about commercialization, we can also discuss about innovation and how we want to promote innovation, but nevertheless, this is linked to major geopolitical challenges. And again, we needed to keep into account the reputation of actors. So Elisabetta Lamboia and her co-authors in the chapter show that we have really a huge potential, but not only a huge potential of new activities that can take place in space, but also of new solutions of problems that we still have on Earth. And this is what makes space particularly interesting. So it's to conclude, I would say, to answer your question, the takeaways are really numerous, and we cannot consider each of them in a separate way. I think that they are all connected. Again, with the idea of repetition, we go back to what I said before and the chapter of Gregory Miller. So I think that a great result with this book is that the concepts, the ideas that each author brings can find a very good connection. They are complementary to each other, and sometimes we have the feeling that we go we close the circle and we put all of that together in a coherent way. So I take the occasion also again to thank Thomas, Mariel, and Bruno, because working with them was great for this book. But I want also to thank all the authors that did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd love to kind of continue on this thread. Bruno, you put together a fascinating chapter introducing the popularization of space. Today there are over 10,000 satellites in space. We have missions, obviously, to the moon and beyond, an expansion of nuclear power, propulsion in space. With more actors in space, this is more innovation, more creative uses of space. What do you see of the implications of this expansion of what I'll call the idea economy in space?
So this part on popularization of space was really fun to put together because you have, on the one hand, practitioners with decades of experience of the European Space Agency, and then you have academics also. And so this was really, this chapter is an odd mix here, and it was really fun to make. So we have, or keep together, I guess. But so we have the new space economy, okay, and in popularization you need, maybe you're thinking about science fiction or comic books or whatever, Star Wars. It's not how popular, it's not just popular culture, okay? It's not that approach. So it's looking at the economy, it's looking at how space is popularized and is a tool of ideology. It's Heraclius's chapter there. It's again the moon and the return of humankind to the moon is a thread going through the book also. And it's also a specific issue of nuclear power, which is, that's why I say this chapter is an odd mix here. But it all comes together beautifully and articulates, because there's a common thread to all these topics. It's how space is no longer about rockets going up. It's about transforming the entire way of life of people on planet Earth, and so this becomes clear on this part here. I would highlight I got some quotes here really interesting. For example, about the lunar race, Piero Messina and Maria Victoria write that the next lunar race is not merely about returning to the moon. It signals a shift in international politics, legal frameworks, and commercial ventures, challenging existing space governance norms. So it just shows you exactly what Mariel's point was of the transformative effect that commercialization is having on international relations, basically. And so I would conclude by adding that the specific issue, for example, including the decision to include here a specific issue on nuclear power and nuclear propulsion in space, is really a choice of highlighting something that will come up and that connects with very important issues. I mean, nuclear power, nuclear energy, also on the mindset of all practitioners of IR. Turn on the light of nuclear weapons, and we really want to give another side, the flip side of nuclear in space. And I would just highlight the value that including that in this handbook gives to the full picture that we were successful in delivering, and we hope it is also the opinion of readers everywhere. Thank you.
Yeah, that's the opinion of this reader, at least. One of my last questions before I turn to some of the questions that we're getting in from our audience, Thomas, I'd love to turn to you and kind of talk broadly about the conclusions of this book and what you've synthesized as what some of the most urgent policy issues are that need to be addressed. I'd love to hear, looking at all the chapters of this book, these fantastic authors that came together to put this resource together, how do you envision space policy evolving in the coming years, and how does this handbook capture those future trends?
Right, let me start by saying that I don't like black and white pictures. I prefer rather what Mariel said yesterday, or I prefer what she said as the great variety of opinions that we find in space, which actually makes up the fascination and the appeal of space. Nevertheless, in the conclusion to this book, I use a black and white picture of war and peace, which might actually be one of the important questions that come up on this planet in the future, and also through space. So the question is then, how can I justify using a black and white picture when I don't like it? And the only reason is that it is based on the relatively rigorous analytical process which underpins this book. So each of the sections, for example, has a chapter on sustainability, a chapter on commercialization, a chapter on militarization, and also one on applications and domestic use. And that leads to 600 pages of academic knowledge, which comes from a 3-year process of a 3 editorial process of actually putting this book together. So on the basis of this, I dared in the conclusion to actually use a black and white picture which of War and Peace, in order to also alert a bit to the dangers that might be out there, but also to the potentials that space holds. I would like to conclude perhaps by reading you this the final passage of the book, which summarizes that very well, and I hope you agree that I do that. If we go back to the archetypal choice of War and Peace, which storyline would you prefer? Peace, in which space can become a medium to allow humankind to spread its wings and realize its best qualities? Or war, where history repeats itself in humankind's oldest vices, which we have thought long vanished? Some may propose, let's do it again, perhaps it works this time. Another age of greatness may then consume humankind. The hope is that when faced with the vast expanses of space, humans will realize that we are small indeed, and that in space it does not matter whether you are American, Russian, Chinese, European, or Nigerian. What matters is first survival, which cannot be done alone, then exploration, which cannot be done alone, and hopefully then the construction of a good interstellar society, which cannot be done alone. The first humans will undoubtedly be ambassadors, but what are they ambassadors of? Humankind, who is ready to make the next step to its development to an interstellar society. In this case, you should read all this book to see where hope can come from, because the shadow of war must remain in the shadows. I wanted to take this step back and actually show that there is more out there than just the technical details that you can find in space discussions sometimes, but this really can have an impact on how world politics work out in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'd love to kind of ask all of your opinions on that. You know, you are all accomplished academics as well as practitioners. I think most of you really engage in the policy space as well. You know, looking at how commercialized, how international space is, where do you see opportunities for that collaboration and cooperation in space? And you know, what are the barriers that you think we can start to talk about now, and some seeds to plant to ensure that we can cooperate and work together, or at least have an understanding of each other when working in space?
I can try and start. Yeah, I appreciate Thomas kind of reading that passage. I think he did a nice job with the conclusion of saying, you know, we can get so focused, and we do need to get focused into these specifics of public-private partnerships and how do we, you know, encourage these different aspects of space policy, how do we deal with governance, but to take that step back and say, really, it's all about, you know, encouraging human progress, about helping us, you know, make these advancements in a sustainable way that allows us to, you know, continue moving forward and not just think about the immediate moment. So it's nice to have that kind of step back of how does this all fit in. But I think more to your question, what are the kind of immediate opportunities for cooperation? I think there's quite a few. So I mean, and I think it depends. Bilateral cooperation among kind of like-minded nations. I think you see that constantly in space. The number of joint space missions that are happening, research collaborations, especially if you include not just government to government, huge, just a very collaborative community in general. I think when you go to, full global coordination, where you might think, okay, this is going to be a little more challenging. Now you've got, the U.S. and China and Russia and Europe and all these different actors involved. I think even there you see cooperation. So you see in our use of weather satellites and coordination in weather forecasting, great global coordination, near Earth objects. So thinking about asteroids or any potentially risks to the Earth, great international coordination that happens there. I think there's a lot of hope for space traffic coordination, where we all have a mutual interest in avoiding accidental collisions in space. Maybe on the moon, where I think, again, we don't want to interfere and cause accidental damage, at least to other people's missions and their scientific efforts. So I think there's a lot there's a lot that's going on already, and there's a lot of opportunity for the future, but it does take work to, it doesn't just happen by itself.
Yeah, I would add to Mariel's point there that I think the moment we're living currently in international relations is, although there are dire straits, for example, in transatlantic relations, I think overall, if we're in a changing period, if we espouse that theory that we're changing from the post-45, 1945 institutions that where the United States had a very important role, in the creation of which the United States had a very important role. But if we're shifting there, that opens an Overton window for multilateralism. I think when everything's on the table, really everything could be on the table, really. And I think space is one of those domains where the cooperation needs to happen. We all realize it. This book, I want to take Thomas's words, proves that it was made by people that have a passion for space and have also a passion for the planet Earth from different perspectives, different points of view. It's just not, I got the feeling working in this team, it was just not one of those books that you write to get another line of publication, you know? It really is, there really is that realization amongst a team of authors and editors that we are really dealing with a topic that is urgent for humankind. And so, speaking of multilateralism, again, this book is in general a call for that action. And I think we're very successful in delivering lines or entry points, or clues for entry points for that cooperation to take place.
Yeah, thank you so much. And kind of, speaking of that transatlantic partnership, I'd love to hear both your perspectives on this topic, and I'll throw in an audience question as well from one of our fantastic interns here, Anna Kelly, who's with the Aerospace Security Project. So as Europe faces an increasing need for more capable low Earth orbit communications constellations, how can Europe's space policy react to this accelerated growth in the satellite industry and maintain leadership? So both kind of that multinational perspective and then looking more specifically at Europe.
Should I go, Thomas?
Go, Antonella, if you have something concrete, yes.
Okay, I think that satellites are a clear example of a kind of essential tool for our life on Earth. And at the same time, it's really a competitive environment. And even if we think about space as a kind of a no-limit space, so with less problems about limited resources, satellites show us that it's not always the case. So there is a lot of competition also for the positioning, for the launching, and so on. So all the considerations that were mentioned before, for me, are well applied in this context. There is this kind of tension between cooperation and competition. And that is where we need to be careful, and we need to create opportunities without depriving future generation and from the access of resources, without limiting the negative impact of human actions in space. So many of the considerations that were made above actually apply in this sector specifically.
Okay. I think if I may respond quickly, I think for me the question is really about institution building. It goes well beyond the satellite sector, and we are very good in Europe to talk about institutions, and so much so that we have too many. There's the European Space Agency, there's the European Union acting in space now, and of course there are all the 27 national space agencies that we have, so which leads to quite a bit of fragmentation in that sector. And one element that I have proposed in this book actually to let's say streamline the European institutional structure for space a bit was the the Space University Institute. To be honest, I push you a bit further into my idealistic direction here, and I will take you almost to Star Trek here, because the idea behind it is a bit like the Starfleet Academy. The question is, or at least in Europe, we have found that the European Space Agency is not fit for purpose to actually bring everything that space can provide to the Europeans. That's also one of the reasons why the European Union has created the EU Space Program Agency, which administers the Galileo program in particular, and also, well, in two elements, the commercialization part of the space sector, but also the militarization, and particularly the defensive part of the militarization of the European space sector. Now, the idea there is, or the question is, how can we nevertheless maintain international collaboration in particular, which the European Space Agency essentially is. It is an international organization which brought together all the European states to work on space policy. And my idea there was that why don't we use that kind of original purpose of the European Space Agency and put it on the international level and see whether we cannot find willing and able states that want to collaborate in civilian projects in space and push the limits of humankind further into space. I think you will almost inevitably run into security issues there, and I'm absolutely sure that the different nation states that we might want to talk about will continue their military space policies. But my hope is that in the civilian sector, and when you limit it to the civilian sector, you can nevertheless find collaboration between different actors on the international stage who are able and willing to do something in space. And that would be something like a Space University Institute, where you can actually bring together all those who have capabilities in space and advance further into space. And that would include, of course, also then the satellite sector. But I think it would go much further than that.
Thank you so much. Another question from our other fantastic CSIS intern, Mia, is looking at the other side of that coin. So looking at geopolitical competition in space, particularly, thinking of a U.S.-China relationship that is very competitive in space, and you're kind of seeing two different paths start to emerge. But there are other countries, like India, that's made significant progress in space, has landed on the moon. How does space policy fit into, India's goals or these other nations who aren't traditional space powers of cementing themselves as actors in the space domain? And how might this have the potential to shift some of these traditional, U.S.-China space competition or maybe impact even the global space order? And then I'll kind of pair that with another question. Thomas, you mentioned in your introductory remarks about a bit of a technology transfer and the relationship between China and Russia. So we have an audience question that would like you to just kind of elaborate on that relationship and what that technology transfer or the relationship in space might mean and have an impact on space policy. So kind of an open question on competition and these global space powers and dynamics that may be shifting.
Mariel, I'll let you, because your hands-on experience on this topic. So
yeah, I can try and take a stab at this one. I think you do see a lot of growth in space activity, across the globe. So not just in the U.S. and China, but as you mentioned, in India, in Japan, in Australia, and Africa. And I think there's two reasons. So I think space has always had this element of sort of prestige and soft power value. It's right at the technological edge of what humans can do to a large extent. And a lot of times these space activities are highly visible, right? So it's a clear signal that you have this technological capability, that you're operating in that space. So I think that's, that element of space still matters for countries. And I think they are thinking about, what image does this project when we develop our space program? But I think especially as you talk about the growth of commercial space, and that's another thing where, I think we saw very much that trend in the U.S., but it is not limited to the U.S. It is also happening in Europe, China, India, other places. And there it's, I think of much more just practical interest in economic growth. I think countries are seeing that innovation in the commercial space sector. So we've had the decrease in the cost of launch. We've seen much more capable small satellites. That opens up the aperture of who can get involved, what it takes to be a startup in space. And so there's just this huge growth. And I think countries are trying to actively support that and encourage that. You see India in particular really starting to invest in kind of the growth of entrepreneurial and commercial space activity. And there I think it's an economic incentive. It's they see this as a place of growth. They want to be involved in that, and that's becoming a global phenomenon as well.
I just add to Mariel's point, for the example of space resource utilization. This was for decades a taboo topic, and a lot of countries weren't moving on that. And then you shifted there's a visible shift to accepting that that's a reality, and then that you can see that on UN COPU's as subcommittee meetings, and the evolution that you had, and all countries majors are accepting that will be a reality. So just an example of the dynamic that Mariel very aptly described.
I maybe add one other thought on this, because I think on your question about kind of what does this mean for competition versus cooperation is interesting also, especially with that commercial dynamic. And I think, we think of the commercial sector and now the kind of growth of the global commercial space sector as competition, right? That, of course, when you're talking about commercial activity, these companies are competing with each other. They're trying to, get the customers and all of that. But they can also play an important role in cooperation and coordination. So again, something like space traffic coordination, where we have all of these satellites going up, many of them commercial. Those commercial actors have a very clear incentive in making sure that they can coordinate. And they want to have, straightforward pathways to do that. That's not the focus of their business. They want that to be, easy. Just, I want to operate my satellite and focus on sales. I want the system to allow me to do that safely, to be in place and allow for that global coordination. So I think we do sometimes see those commercial actors who just have this, very clear goals, be able to kind of contribute to that and say, hey, we got to get this figured out. So it's sort of an interesting role that I think the commercial sector can play in both competition and cooperation as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Antonella or Thomas, I'd love your opinions on this as well.
Antonella, do you want to go first? I can also, if you like, but... All right. Makena, the question the way you posed the question was very much reflected Earth geopolitics, and I think in the relationship between China and Russia, the main event that changed their relationship is the Russian attack on Ukraine. And we hear in the press more and more now that Russia is in a war economy, and I think it's important to say here that the war economy is not an advantage. It destroys the country, it destroys Ukraine, of course, but it also destroys Russia. And in that sense, if you're talking geopolitics, that space in that relation between China and Russia is really only an aspect of Earth geopolitics. And if you apply that kind of logic, then what you can clearly see is a declining Russia in terms of power, and therefore also, I would say, a geopolitical shift towards Russia becoming a vassal state of China. And space is then really only one aspect of that. What I'd like to emphasize, however, is that, and what we've tried to say in this book, is that space has the potential to take us beyond those earthly geopolitics. And Mariel, for example, yesterday mentioned the International Space Station, at which Russia and the United States have worked together even during the most difficult times, and even today. So my hope would be that space can actually be can provide a ground for understanding and for progress for the whole of for the whole of humankind.
If I can add something to what Thomas said, I completely agree, and I'd like to go back to some ideas that were mentioned in the book. For example, theories such as cosmopolitanism, which mentioned the necessity of international or supranational institutions. And I would say that when there is a strong competition, actually institutions can be a kind of can create a framework for sitting around the table, discuss and find common interests. And usually this kind of common interests force the competitors to find a relation that is more a win-win situation. And this is something that sometimes we forget, because we think that we think to space in terms of a new space race, and so first arrival, first served. We must be quick. We must come before the others to get a better position, and maybe this kind of rush let us forget about the fact that there is also space for cooperation, which bring a more long-term stability for competitors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. We have another question here from Dr. Jack Gregg, who's an author and an adjunct professor, about commercial space. So looking at the commercial space economy, do you see it more as a space-to-space economy or a space-to-Earth economy? Bruno, I might ask your opinion.
Upstream, downstream, I guess that's the question. Well, that leads us to ponder what is a space economy really? Is that a concept really? Right. I mean, it's not clear what the concept of, when you think about space economy, new space economy, all this, these concepts are not clear. I think there's no set definition of the new space economy. What does it exactly mean? How do you measure it? So the question is right in pointing out, I think upstream, downstream. I think that's where the gentleman was getting at, and the value of it. And right now, what we see, and then Mariel has again hands-on experience on this, is the value of the private sector bringing in novel services. And you see that, and I take Thomas's point there of the war in Ukraine. You see the war in Ukraine as really becoming the first transparent war in human history, fully transparent. And that transparency of the battlefield comes exactly from the commercial added value in those new types of services. So Earth observation, data, but also, so satellite pictures used to be where, I'm an elder millennial, so it used to be that satellite pictures was something that you rarely saw in the media. And now the media coverage is highlighting that. Why? Because of space commercialization. So that added value of transparency of the battlefield. Also contributing to that is telecoms. So Starlink has allowed any person in the world to be a scrutinizer of the theater of operations, of the modern theater of operations. That, the war in Ukraine brings us that. Anybody with a cell phone can scrutinize the war, can contribute to the war effort, they can make donations, all from any point in the world with their cell phone, based on the information that is being gathered in the battlefield by people with other cell phones connecting with Starlink, where communications are no longer available. So I would take that question, and instead of leading it to economics, which is not my field of expertise, I would lead it to show how commercialization has changed fundamentally one of the main characteristics of the human being, which is violence and organized violence. And so it made it more transparent, And this is here to stay. Of course, it's all the changes to the battlefield, drone warfare. I mean, tanks are useless at this point. All that, but I would use that question to highlight this. Of course, you do have the peaceful side of things, and 50%. I think I saw a statistic from the European Agency for the Space Program, which is 50% of the apps. It doesn't sound like a lot, but because we have a lot of apps on our phones, we start thinking half of my apps, but it's 50% of the apps are dependent on space-based technology. So it measuring the upstream and the downstream side of the space economy needs to factor in the degree of dependency also that we have of space technologies. And that brings us also to other side issues like cybersecurity, space infrastructure, and whatnot. So I would leave it at that. It's a very broad question.
Yeah, that's a great reminder that we're using space technologies, and we're enabled by space every day. Even doing this, this book talk, we couldn't do it without space applications. So, the commercial industry has kind of crept in, and it's easy to forget how dependent we are. But that's a great reminder.
Yeah, I can add a little bit, I think, to that question too. So I think it gets at some interesting elements. And one thing we talk about in the space community fairly often is, what do we really mean by commercial space? So, a lot of times when we talk about it, we're defining it to mean there's some significant amount of private capital investment and, risk taken on by the company itself, right? And if they do that, we'll usually kind of lump them into the commercial space activity. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the customers are commercial, right? So other than maybe satellite communications, I think where they do have a commercial company selling to individuals or on a commercial basis, a lot of times the customers for these companies are largely governments. That's where most of the revenues are coming from. So it's a little bit different spin on commercial than we might think about with our normal goods in our lives. And I think one other element of this, so in the chapter I have on the strategic interest in cislunar in the United States, I look at commercial cislunar activity, and there's talk about just like a space community, or a space economy. There's talk about a cislunar economy, right? And so one of the things I do in that chapter is say, is that real? What would that mean? And I think exactly to the question, a lot of what we see right now in terms of commercial activity in cislunar is space to space. So it's the U.S. government has plans to go to the moon or wants to do science on the moon, and there are commercial entities putting in their own, capital and taking on some risk to sell to NASA and help support that mission, right? Or sell to the military for some of the missions that they're doing. So they are commercial companies involved in cislunar, but it's to support other, activity around the moon. The part of the cislunar economy that would be actually getting resources or doing something else that would ultimately benefit a customer on Earth, or bring revenue into kind of the normal Earth economy, that is much more limited right now. So right now it's really helping to make exploration and other activity less expensive, but it's not really that space to Earth, at least in the cislunar context.
Great, thank you. And unfortunately, I think we're just about at time here, even though I think I could talk to the four of you about your opinions in this handbook for the whole day. But I'd love to end with kind of a rapid fire to each of you. The handbook covers a myriad of topics. We just kind of scratched the surface today. I'd love to hear what maybe is one space policy development that you are really looking forward to, hopefully being accomplished, written about in the next 5 years. And that can be, in the area that you're focused in any international, context. But I'd love to hear kind of what's one priority item for you all, and maybe, how the handbook influenced that. So maybe I'll start with Antonella, and we can go around this virtual table.
Thank you. Maybe because of my legal background, but I'm really looking forward to a clarification of the existing legal framework, which is currently based on the main space treaties. which were concluded in a period of time when we didn't have space commercialization and the geopolitical scenario was completely different. So nowadays we have new challenges. Nevertheless, we believe that many principles that are stated in these treaties should be there in the future too. So how do we make that possible? And we'll be able to sit again around the table to fill the gaps that maybe we have, or to implement the existing rule in a way that is beneficial. That is my point.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thomas, I'd love your perspective.
Sure. I'd like to see a permanent presence of humans on the moon. Ideally in the concept of a moon village in which everyone can work together for on civilian projects, ideally exploration. But really the presence on the moon, I think, will be a major step for humankind.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say to me the highest priority and the area I'm watching most closely is related to space sustainability. So we've talked a bunch of times about the growth of commercial activity, the expansion of the number of countries involved in space activity, which is all really exciting, but also leads to these issues of space becoming increasingly congested. And I think we do need attention to those safety-oriented issues. I think it's an area that we're poised to make progress on as an international community, but I think that's something I'm watching very closely. I think is important, and you certainly see it in the handbook, space sustainability. There's a chapter on that topic across every section in the book. So I think we recognize, the community recognizes that's something that needs a lot of attention.
Great, thanks.
Well, in the context of commercialization, to me, the big question is, what is the role of the state? And that is an issue for the space economy. That is an issue coming up in the United States, and that's also an issue coming up in Europe. And to me, there's this basic idea that a perceived lack of policy is often just a lack of leadership. And one question that will need to be answered is, what is the role of the state in the space economy, and the commercialization? So that's where I'm looking at.
Fantastic. Well, that was a great array of final answers. Again, you really cover, you span a ton of topics, and this has been a fascinating conversation. So I'd like to thank you all for joining me today, and thank you for putting together this great resource. And thank you to those of you who tuned in online. I'd also like to extend a thank you to our program coordinator, Kendra Lefebvre, for making this event possible, and for all of you who are interested. So please, a reminder to read this fantastic resource that this group has put together, the Routledge Handbook on Space Policy, and I hope that you'll join us again next time. Have a great day.